Hey everybody, this fall I am preaching through Galatians, and so I thought I would give you a quick preview of what Galatians is all about. For those of you using the sermon series in your community groups, I hope this is helpful to have just a little bit of a head start as you get ready to lead your discussions. So, Galatians is a letter from the Apostle Paul to churches in Galatia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And these were churches that he planted, and after a while moved on to another part of the world. And then later, we don't know how much later, but months or years later, received troubling reports about what was going on back at those churches. And we see that right away in the letter in Galatians chapter 1. It doesn't start like a customary letter of Paul, like Philippians or like Colossians, where he has this like extended introduction, greetings, accolades, you're doing so great, keep it up. Instead, he starts right away in verse 6 by saying he is astonished that the Galatians have so quickly deserted God and the gospel. So something serious must have happened. So it's worth knowing a little bit about the background, because Paul just kind of jumps right into it. And if you don't know what he's talking about, he is obviously very upset and concerned about something. So here it is. There is a group of people, he calls them false brothers at one point. He calls them something that can get translated like Judaizers, is what theologians often call them. That word comes out in chapter 2, verse 14. People who are acting Jewish, even though they've converted to Christianity. Let me explain who these folks are as best as we can tell. Remember that the early church was a mix of Jewish and Gentile converts. This is most clear actually in the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 15, there is something called the Jerusalem Council, where the Jewish converts to Christianity, really led by Peter in many ways, and the Gentile converts, many of them became Christians because of Paul, they have to work out just how Jewish their lifestyle needed to be. In other words, how much of the Old Testament law, the dietary restrictions, for instance, celebrating the Passover, just those kind of things that were deeply ingrained in the Jewish life for thousands of years, how much of that would carry over into the Christian life, especially for those who weren't ethnically Jewish. So Gentiles, like the Galatians. So what seems to have happened is that Paul leaves, a group comes in shortly afterwards and says, oh, Paul told you about Jesus, that's great, you need to receive him as the Messiah in order to be saved. But he didn't tell you about all the other things that you have to do, all the other laws that you have to keep. And one of their main concerns is the issue of circumcision, which in our day and age, that might sound strange that was such a focus, but think about the fact that for the Jewish people, circumcision was the covenant sign and seal. It was the mark of being set apart by God. It had been that way since Genesis chapter 17, and it had been that way all the way through the history of God's Old Testament people. And so now you have Gentiles joining the church who don't bear that mark, who aren't circumcised. And so there's this big debate over whether or not that was necessary in order to be saved. At least it was a debate among this one group. Paul wants to make it very clear in Galatians that we are saved because of what Jesus has done for us on the cross, and nothing more. And so really the theme of Galatians, once you begin to get into it, is Paul saying over and over again in different ways, God accepts us because of Jesus' finished work on the cross. And there's nothing you have to do or can do to add to that. And he's saying that against the backdrop of a group of people who are sowing seeds of doubt in the Galatians' mind of like, have we done enough in order for God to be happy with us? Or do we need to start doing this and adding this and making sure we have this part of our life squared away? So Paul's responding to that, and he's doing so strongly, which tells you that he's not just like tweaking theology here. He realizes that the heart of the gospel of grace is at stake. And so he is all in the first few chapters trying to explain that. The way that the book breaks down then is he really spends the first 4 chapters defending the gospel of grace against this error of adding to the finished work of Christ. So he's going to get at that from a few different angles. And then in chapter 5, he says, and it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. So you are free from the obligations of the law, but that doesn't mean you're free to live any way you want, because if you really understand grace, it's going to change everything. And so he goes on in the next 2 chapters to apply the gospel of grace to our everyday lives. All right, so that's the basic overview of the book. Let me give you a couple phrases and themes you're going to hear over the next few months that I hope just by explaining them now, you'll be able to listen for them and talk about them in your groups. First of all, I've kind of said it already, but I'll say it again, that the gospel is good news because Jesus has done everything required to make you right with God. And you can't add to that. And you don't have to earn that. And you don't have to keep working at it. It's true once and for all. The other way this is going to come in is in the wonderful doctrine of adoption that pops up in chapters 3 and 4. This idea that Jesus is our elder brother, and because of what he's done for us, he brings us into God's family, and we're now God's sons and daughters, that he delights in us, and that we can delight in him. So that's something else, especially by the time we get to those passages later in the fall. You'll hear a lot about adoption and being part of God's family and what a privilege that is. You're also going to hear discussions about freedom in Christ. What does it mean to be free in Christ? Does it mean you can do whatever you want and there are no consequences? Does it mean that God doesn't really care about sin in your life anymore? Like, what does it really mean? I think we often fall into either legalism or license, just living any way we want, or living with a very legalistic mindset. And there's a middle ground that Paul clears the ground for us on. It just is very, very helpful in thinking through how to actually live this out. And that's especially going to be true in the last couple chapters. And in the midst of all of that, what Paul wants to hammer home for us is that the more we understand who we are in Christ, the more fully and joyfully we can live for him. And so we're going to see that pattern again and again. Galatians is a great book. It's a great book because for those of us who just need a refresher course on the gospel, it's going to give us that. For those who maybe don't really know what the gospel is, it lays it out very starkly and very in a very compelling way. And then the fact is, we never outgrow the gospel. We never get beyond this fundamental idea that our relationship with God is based on what Jesus has done for us. And so that's good for us to remember every Sunday, and Galatians is really going to help us to do that. The subtitle of the sermon series is one you've heard before, Grace Changes Everything. We have a chance each Sunday this fall to unpack that a bit more and apply it to our lives. So thank you for doing that with your community groups. It's much appreciated and bears much fruit. And thanks for praying for me as I and the rest of the pastoral team preach this fall on Galatians, and we look forward to seeing you on Sunday.